All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you again for coming today. My name is Dr. Andrea Welker. I am the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and a Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Villanova University. And today I'm going to be talking to you about residential rain gardens. So I've gone over a couple of these things already, but just to have them up here on the screen, some housekeeping items are to please put your questions in the chat. We've muted all the participants during the talk, and also be ready to answer some polls either on your computer or on your phone so that I can get a gauge of what you're thinking and where you're at in your rain garden journey. So what I'm going to be talking about today is starting from the very beginning, which is the hydrologic cycle. I find that that is a really useful place to start talking about stormwater and the need for stormwater control measures such as rain gardens. And then I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on the design and installation of rain gardens, and then provide some additional resources and follow up with some questions. All right, so we are going to get started with a poll, and the poll is, I or someone I know has a rain garden in their yard. And the way that you can answer this poll is to either text Nova Engineer 001 to 37607. And then once you join, you can either click A or B. Or you can go to pollev.com/Nova Engineer 002. And then also you'll be able to answer the poll. So Kevin, Ryan, if you're able to access the poll, if you give me like a thumbs up in the chat, that would, or in the, so I can see your screen, that would be great. So I know that it's actually working. Oh, we've got an answer. So I know it is working, at least for some folks. All right, so the yeses have made a significant comeback. Let's let this stay up here for a little bit longer, and we'll see if we start to stabilize here with our answers. All right, so it looks like we've got a significant number of people that either have a rain garden or know someone that has a rain garden. So that's great news. That kind of allows me to think a little bit more about how I'm going to be talking about the topic today. And we're just going to dive right into the hydrologic cycle. Okay, so if you remember back to school, or maybe your children when they were in school, they learned about the hydrologic cycle, and you probably did at one point. And because this is a cycle, I could pick any point on here and get started with it. But the point I'm going to select to get started explaining the hydrologic cycle and linking that to development is starting with the rain clouds. So if we start from rain, what we can see is that when the rain comes, right, it can either precipitate, right? So either hit the ground, right? Or we have, and once it hits the ground, it can either do one of two things. It can either run off, right? Or infiltrate into the ground. So if it's infiltrating into the ground, it then has a couple of choices of what can happen. It can either be sucked back up by the plants and then evapotranspired back into the clouds, or that water can then percolate down into the groundwater table. And from there, it can travel via base flow into receiving water bodies such as streams, creeks, or lakes. And if it runs off, right, which is this arrow right here, it's going to directly enter into receiving water bodies such as a lake, a stream, and then of course, if it's entering through a stream, it can eventually make its way to the ocean. So water can then get back into the atmosphere by evapotranspiring from plants or directly evaporating from receiving water bodies. And then of course it goes back up to the clouds, and then the whole thing just starts over again. So that hydrologic cycle is going to be occurring no matter what we as humans do, right? So that's just, part of nature. So if we think about though what could happen when we do have development. Let's see if I can get the slide to advance. There we go. We see that we disrupt this hydrologic cycle. And what happens is there is evapotranspiration that's still occurring, but because there's less trees and less vegetation, there's going to be less evapotranspiration that occurs. There is also less evapotranspiration that occurs because there's less infiltration that's occurring, because this runoff arrow becomes much, much bigger than it was before. So the hydrologic cycle's gotten disrupted by our development, which again has implications for the amount of evapotranspiration that occurs, the amount of runoff that occurs, the amount of water that feeds into our groundwater table, and the amount of water that actually reaches receiving water bodies in the form of base flow. So what we see as the humans that are kind of standing around the environment and taking a look at this is that there's more flash flooding. And I think a lot of us have probably experienced that in our lifetime, that we know that creeks or streams that were, these smaller streams that probably didn't cause flooding before suddenly are causing flooding now and have very high velocity stream flows. And that high velocity stream flow can also result in more erosion occurring in the stream and then sediment getting deposited somewhere else. Keeping in mind that erosion and sedimentation is part of the natural process. It's just that now we've sort of put so much more water into the receiving water body, into that creek or that stream, that the amount of erosion occurring and then consequently the amount of sedimentation that's occurring somewhere else is out of whack. We also find that we have hotter runoff entering into the creeks because of the fact that the stormwater runoff is traveling over top of heated surfaces such as parking lots or roadways, that we have this hotter runoff that's entering into our creeks, which is not good for the wildlife that is living in those creeks. I mentioned that we also have less infiltration, which is going to result in less base flow. So the cooler water that would normally be feeding a stream under more continuous conditions can dry up over time. So a stream that always had water in it may switch from being a perennial stream, so something that always has water into it, into an intermittent stream, so something that only has water in it during rain events. The other thing that we see can be a drop in the groundwater table, because again, that decrease in the amount of infiltration will also cause a decrease in the amount of percolation that occurs, meaning that less water will be making it to the groundwater table. So in response to this, there's been a big shift occurring worldwide in how we handle stormwater. So originally, if we go back to say like the 50s, 60s, 70s, when we would develop, the major goal was to think only about larger storms, really think only about flooding events. And the goal was to get rid of the water as fast as humanly possible. And it was also a very centralized approach, right? So let's build a really, really enormous detention basin for this entire development of homes. And it also had a lot of piping, a lot of what we call gray infrastructure installed to control all of that stormwater. Over the past decade or so, we've seen a big shift in how people are thinking about controlling stormwater, and it really ties back into that hydrologic cycle and thinking about how can it be that we can develop, we can live the lives that we want to live, have houses, get to work, that sort of thing, but still maintain that hydrologic cycle. And the way to do that is to think about controlling smaller storms. And I'll give you some reasons behind controlling smaller storms in a minute. Hold on to your water to the best of your ability at your own location. So that leads to a very decentralized approach. So instead of there being one enormous singular facility to handle all the stormwater, let's say for residential development, we're going to have multiple rain gardens on everyone's property, controlling the stormwater that is generated on that property. This approach is often called green infrastructure. So we're moving from a gray approach to a green approach. And what's kind of happening over time, and this really does make sense, is that more often we're seeing a real hybrid approach where gray infrastructure, we can't just completely get rid of it. We still need to have piping systems. We still need to have flood control mechanisms available to handle large quantities of water. But if we partner that with green infrastructure, we get a really effective system. So I mentioned that this was really a worldwide approach, and I wanted to show you some examples from Ireland, where they are also thinking in the same way. So how do they control stormwater, and how can they restore the hydrologic cycle? And at this particular home, they have an infiltration trench, which is underneath of that maintenance hole that you see there in front of their front door. They have what they call a soakaway and what we would call a rain garden to control more of the water. And they also have a rain barrel. So they're using 3 different approaches to control the stormwater that's generated on their property. So depending on where you are, there are a lot of different words used to describe this approach. And I want to throw them all up here now because the terminology can get a little bit confusing. So low impact development refers to a whole suite of practices to try to minimize the impact of development. Stormwater control measures are just one piece of that low impact development practice. We also hear people use the term best management practice, or BMP, to describe these. Green stormwater infrastructure, I mentioned that concept already. And again, the idea is that we are going to control stormwater in a green fashion. It implies that we're going to be using vegetation to help us control stormwater. Stormwater control measures is also used. Stormwater management practices is used quite often. And then the concepts of sustainable urban drainage systems, or just sustainable drainage systems, is more commonly used in Europe and in Australia and New Zealand. They all really refer to the same idea, which is trying to control stormwater in a very decentralized fashion, in a greener way, using vegetation to the best of your ability, and trying to keep your stormwater on your site. So let's talk about rain gardens specifically, since that is the title of the talk here. These facilities can be used, rain gardens can be used at multiple scales. So they are actually my favorite type of stormwater control measure. You can use them alongside highways. You can use them at schools. You can use them at your house. You can use them at a bank. So you can apply this technique nearly anywhere. And it can be very sophisticated, like we see here with a domed riser, and we have an overflow, or we can do something a lot simpler, which is what I'm going to talk about for residential use. And one of the fantastic side effects of rain gardens is that they can really be quite beautiful. So I'll show you some photos as we move through, really highlighting the co-benefits of rain gardens. So this bottom rain garden is at the Abington Friends School in Abington. And this is a very beautiful feature that's been constructed on, on the school's property. And this is a, sorry, this is a movie that was taken during a storm event. And this was before the vegetation really took over. What's great about looking at these features before they're fully vegetated is that you can see how the water is moving through. So let's just take a look at this. If I can get back to the slide that I want, hold on here. Okay, so let's try to make this movie work again. So here we have a rainstorm that's occurring. This is a larger rain event, more than an inch. The water enters into the rain garden, fills it up. And then it infiltrates into the ground over time. So this is what we want our rain garden to do, right? We want it to accept the water that comes into it, and then we want it to infiltrate that water over time. And we want the plants and the vegetation that are there to control the water through evapotranspiration. So that leads to the two major processes that are occurring in a rain garden. So the water comes in and fills up the depression, and then the water infiltrates in over time. So that top series of photos, again, that is the stormwater control measure that we built on campus here. And this picture was taken a very long time ago. So if you happen to be able to have really great eyes, and you can see that that picture was actually taken in 2002. That's before all the vegetation got established in that rain garden. And again, I'm using this photo because it really does show the water going in and it ponding and then infiltrating in over time. This rain garden is very, very well vegetated now. The other process that's occurring is evapotranspiration. And the plants that you plant in your rain garden will help to remove the water from the soil, thus creating space in the voids of your rain garden to allow new water to come in and soak into the ground. And again, they're also quite beautiful. So you can see in the photos here, especially the one that's all the way on the right, there's two bees hanging out on the plant. So these can be a great way for you to attract pollinators to your yard. So one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that rain gardens do not have to be enormous for them to be very effective. And that's one of the things that I think scares a lot of homeowners off, is that they're almost viewing these as flood control features. And I want to assure you that that's not really the goal of what you're trying to do. If you can just control the first inch or so of rain that falls on your property, you're going to control between 90 and 94% of the rain that falls on your property. Now, I understand that with climate change, we do expect storms to become more intense and to be larger over time. That being said, If you still just focus on managing the first, say, quarter inch to inch of rain that falls on your property, you're going to make an enormous difference in how much water you collect. Another slightly less pretty graph that shows this same thing that was compiled by the Philadelphia Water Department showed that when they looked at a very big data set, right? So over the past almost 60 years, so 1948 to 2006, once again, they found that most of the rain events were 1 inch or less. And so what we're looking at here, let me see if I can get my highlighter back, is that if we look at total amount of rainfall and we look at 1 inch here and we just sort of come straight across, we find that again, 90% of the rain events that happened in that 60-year time period were 1 inch or less. And if you consider the fact that all of these bigger storms also had a first inch, again, controlling the first inch of rain can be a very, very effective strategy. Usually we also have about 7 days or more in between rain events in this area. So while we do occasionally see back-to-back events, it's not very common around here. So we usually have plenty of time for the water to go into the rain garden, soak into the ground, be used by plants before it rains again. So let's talk about some of the key elements of a rain garden. Things that you're going to want to think about are where you want to place this, what kind of soils you have, the size, the depth, and the shape of the rain garden, how you're actually going to install it, what plants you want to buy, and then think carefully about the overflow, because you will definitely encounter overflow with your rain garden. It's not going to be possible for you to build a rain garden that's going to be big enough to handle all rain events that occur. The other thing that I just want to address is that some people on the call today may live in a township that has a stormwater fee. And if that's the case, it might be that depending on where you're living, that you may be able to get a credit for installing a rain garden on your property. And that's something that I would encourage you to go and talk to your township about if you are in a township with a stormwater fee. All right, so let's talk a little bit about location. And I have another question for you, which is, do you have a location in mind for your rain garden, and where do you think you might put it? So again, you can either go on the internet and go to pollev.com/NovaEngineer002, or you can text your answer in. All right, so we've got some good answers here. Now I've got some things I want to address when I start talking about location, particularly sun and shade, and then also dealing with slopes. Let's see some other stuff. Yeah, neighborhoods run off. That's always an issue. All right, so lots of folks thinking about the front yard and backyard. So we've got a nice variety of locations. All right, so let's talk about location. So some things to think about. A good rule of thumb is to place it about 10 feet away from your house. Again, that's a rule of thumb. If you're at, say 7 feet, don't panic. This is just a mitigation measure to make sure that you aren't going to end up flooding your basement inadvertently. So 10 feet is a nice rule of thumb. I heard or saw a number of people answered that they were going to take advantage of where their downspouts were. That's great. You can take advantage of that, right? So you can buy downspout extensions, right? So those plastic tubes that you can use to direct the water into your rain garden. I've also seen people put a stone kind of dry dry river, so to speak, right? So where they direct the water over a stone bed into their rain garden. And I saw a number of people were taking advantage of runoff that already comes into their property. So that's going to make it a little bit easier for you to get the water into your rain garden. More level obviously makes things easier. You want to end up with the bottom of your rain garden being as level as possible to encourage as much infiltration to occur as you can. One of the folks here mentioned that they had a very sloped yard. If that's the case, what you really want to do is get the water to enter on the long side of your rain garden. So sort of the opposite of the situation that I'm showing in this photo here, right? So this photo has a very, very level yard. So it really doesn't matter where the water is coming into on this particular rain garden because it's incredibly level. But if you have a slope, you're going to need to try to work a little harder to get the bottom of the rain garden to be level. And again, your life is going to be a little bit easier if the water comes in on the long side of the slope. You do not want to place these over top of the septic system because again, you don't want to be encouraging water to enter into your septic system. If you are looking at a tree, it's going to be really difficult for you to do a lot of digging around that tree because you're going to have too many roots. And if you know you have a high water table, so that means less than about 2 feet from the surface, that wouldn't be a great place for you to put your rain garden because you aren't going to be able to take advantage of infiltration. That water will just hit the groundwater table and have really nowhere else to go. All right, so let's talk about soils. The one thing that you might want to do is go out and determine if your soil is going to have adequate infiltration capacity. When we design these for commercial use, we do much more sophisticated tests than this, but really what you're looking to answer is, will the water be able to infiltrate into the ground or not? So I would recommend that you just dig a hole to the depth that you're planning on making your rain garden, fill it up with water, and make sure that it goes away within 12 to 24 hours. If you are looking at your soils and you're saying these are too compact, it's too clayey, you can add some sand. And then you can also add in some compost, but I would highly recommend not going completely crazy with the compost. If we think about most soils that we grow our plants in, they usually only have about 1 to 5% organics. Now, compost can help you because it can help fluff things up a little bit and provide you with a little more, decrease the amount of compaction that you might be having normally with your soil if you're going somewhere where it's just been lawn for a very long period of time. Lots of people have been running over it. Years and years of lawnmowers back and forth, all of that can serve to compact your soil quite a bit. So you definitely want to loosen up the soil, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about installation. So the the figure that I have here on the right-hand side shows you what the different soil layers around here look like. So most of the soils in this region have been weathered in place. So what you will see as you dig down deeper and deeper looks a lot like this, where you've got your very top layer where you may have grass now. Then you've got what we would consider quote unquote topsoil. And then you're going to start to see some color changes where you get less organics in the soil. And then eventually you're going to get to the point where you see more and more rocks, and then you would hit bedrock. You're really not going to be digging down deep enough for the most part for you to get down to bedrock. You're going to be staying up in those topper reaches. And if you do have a very small zone of topsoil, then that's when you're going to need to add in some more organic material to make sure that you can sustain plant life. So one of the things I also wanted to address was mosquitoes, because lots of people are worried about mosquitoes. And if you're like me, you get bitten quite a bit when you go outside. And we all know that's terribly unpleasant. We don't want to encourage mosquitoes to live. But one of the things I want to assure you is that it takes about 7 to 14 days for mosquitoes to go from an egg all the way to an adult. And even Asian tiger mosquitoes, which are now really the dominant mosquito that I find in my own backyard, it's a lot faster, but it's still about a week. So if you follow that guideline of making sure that the water can drain away within 12 to 48 hours, you are not going to be encouraging any mosquito life in your yard. So let's talk about the size, depth, and shape. So if you happen to know the drainage area, a good rule of thumb would be that the size of your rain garden should be about 30% of the size of your drainage area. If you don't know what this is, don't worry about it. Most of the time, people are just constrained by the size of the rain garden they can install on a certain piece of their property, right? So you're not really thinking that much about drainage area. You're just thinking about taking the opportunity to install a rain garden in the space that you have. So even if you only have a small amount of space, whatever it is that you put in, it's going to help. So if you're not controlling a whole inch of water that falls, maybe you're only controlling a half an inch or a quarter inch. That's still contributing to controlling the water that is generated on your property. The depth of these rain gardens can vary between 3 inches and 10 inches. And then you also really want to think about how this is going to fit in with the rest of your yard and how you're going to be able to maintain it. So nice sweeping sides to your rain garden is going to help you with mowing around it or helping a landscaper that you might hire to mow around it and to keep it looking nice. You know, you don't want a very stark rectangular shape in your yard. You would rather have something that looks a little more natural and that, again, you can actually mow around. The other thing that you're going to want to do is try to minimize erosion both into and out of your rain garden by letting that overflow occur over a stone area. Or the other thing you can do is install an overflow pipe if you have a more sophisticated system. So that would just be a raised pipe that goes down into another pipe that then perhaps could come out on another part of your yard. And that way you could have the water that overflow that way. Or again, you can have it overflow over the top of your berm, and I would just armor that part of the berm. So things that you would probably want to rent. A sod cutter is going to help you a lot to get rid of the grass that's on the top. You can use elbow grease. You can just get in there with a shovel and get it out. The other thing that I find to be very useful is a rototiller, and that helps you break up the soil that you have there, incorporate any sand that you might want to incorporate any compost that you might want to incorporate, and it really provides you with a nice loosened substrate to plant your plants into. Now, all of that soil that you take out, you can use that to make your berms. And so when you're building this, you want to compact the berm around your rain garden, but you want to make sure that you don't compact the bottom of your rain garden. So you're trying to encourage infiltration to occur, and you want to keep the soil as loose as possible. And again, you want to armor the inflow and the outflow to prevent erosion. If you've got a long stone path, like we can see on the side on this picture that I have here, there's a bit of a stone path for her overflow. So let me grab my my little highlighter again. Right, so this area right here, again, in my experience, weeds love to grow up through here. So you may want to get a weed barrier to place underneath of this stone and use this. I said, in this case, this is the outflow mechanism, right? So the water is coming into her rain garden from her property. They've also directed some of their downspouts into this, and then this is the overflow mechanism. So plants. One of the questions that comes up all the time with rain gardens is, what plants should I use? And the key things that you want to do are to buy plants that are going to survive in your yard. So one of the folks earlier mentioned that they have a rain garden that they would like to install, and it's very shady. I too have a rain garden that's in a lot of shade, and my native plant nursery helped me find plants that did well in shady conditions. So some of those were purple turtlehead, Joe Pyeweed, which I find just does well everywhere. It's like one of my favorite plants in the whole wide world. Ferns. So there's lots of native plants that can do really well in both light, very, very light conditions and very dark conditions. But the plants also have to be able to handle both wet and dry. So that's another thing that you want to really think about when you are planting your rain garden. Or again, plants that can handle wet and dry conditions. So plants that I've had some, it said also good luck with: cardinal flower. So you saw that earlier, that was the red flower that I showed you. Black-eyed Susans do really well in sunny conditions, handling both wet and dry. Purple coneflower or echinacea also does well, sunny conditions, both wet and dry. Purple turtlehead, I've had good luck with that, wet and dry conditions, in shadier conditions. And then I said Joe Pyeweed just seems to do well everywhere. You can place a light coating of mulch after you plant to reduce weed growth. And you may have to water at first if it doesn't rain. And I always only half jokingly say that the best way to make a drought happen is to install a new stormwater control feature, because it seems like anytime we do this, it stops raining and then you're outside trying to get your plants established. So just be ready that you may have to do some watering at first to get those plants to establish in your property. And I said a good native plant nursery is really helpful. I'll provide 2 recommendations of plant nurseries that I really like that are fairly close to this region. So some lessons that I've learned: I have 2 rain gardens in my yard, one in a sunny location, one in a shady location, is that a lot of landscapers don't really know about native plants, and they don't really know about rain gardens. So there's going to have to be a lot of communications. I can tell you some of my bad stories are that I've had my rain gardens filled up to the top with mulch because they wanted to level it out. I've had all of my native plants ripped out because they thought they were all weeds. So you really have to do, like I said, a lot of communication and make sure that if someone's working in your yard, that they understand, I said, what's important to you, and they understand what you're considering a plant, because it might not be the same thing that they are. The other thing is that you have to be prepared to do some maintenance to your rain garden. So it's going to need some weeding. And if you do end up with a really unusually large storm, It may erode some of your overflow feature. It might do some erosion into your inflow feature. So you may have to build that berm back up, or you may have to move the rocks back around because they might get shifted around during a rain event. But a huge lesson that I've learned is that these are really beautiful and they attract all sorts of butterflies, bees, hummingbirds. Again, I keep singing the praises of Joe Pyeweed. I said, it is my favorite plant. It is so covered with bees in my yard and so covered with butterflies. It's just an amazing thing to look at, and just makes you love having the rain garden in your yard. So I mentioned some native plant nurseries. Redbud Native Nursery is down by Media, and then Yellow Springs Farm is another one that's up just north of the Turnpike. Both of them have very knowledgeable staff that can help you, and they can point you in the direction of the right plant for the conditions that you have. So again, the things you want to emphasize are wet and dry conditions and what lighting you expect to have. Peck has an amazing resource. It is a create your own rain garden PDF. It's about 35 pages long or so, and leads you through this step by step. So if you don't feel like watching this presentation again, or you decide that you want to sort of have something to carry outside with you as you're building your rain garden, I would highly recommend that you take a look at that resource. And at this point, I would like to just kind of wrap things up with one last poll. So what are your thoughts about rain gardens? Is there anything that's that you're still wondering about? Are you excited? Are you scared? So tell me what your thoughts are. Oh, that warms my heart. It seems easy. That's what I want to hear. All right, so it looks like we've got some hopeful people. We have someone who still says that they're scary. Hopefully we can answer some questions and allay some of those fears. But yeah, thinking about what works, plants, that they can be impactful. All right, well, this is great stuff. So at this point, what I want to do is thank the folks that helped me put this on. So I want to thank my university, the Villanova University College of Engineering, and the Center for Resilient Water Systems in particular, and the William Penn Foundation for putting me in contact with Wissahickon Trails and making them such a great partner to work with. And at this point, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, there wasn't many questions throughout the presentation, but some popped up at the end. The first question I have, well, it's not really a question, I think he's looking for advice, is my garden is too deep. I hit clay and I can't plant in that soil. That question's from Bob.
Okay, Bob. Oof. Okay. So I think you've got a couple of things that you can still do. Um, if your rain garden isn't super deep, what you can do is just plant a lot more plants and make your rain garden so that it's actually larger, so that you have a larger area with a more shallow depth. And then the plants should still be able to suck up the water and use it, but you're going to have to do a more like a broader, more shallow feature.
Good answer. I didn't think of that either. That's very innovative. The next question is from Greta. She says, what's the minimum size? We have a small yard with some trees.
Yes. So hopefully, some of the photos that I tried to show were very small rain gardens, right? That there was one that was just a pretty tiny rain garden that's off to the side of someone's driveway. And even if you could just take the water off of your driveway, for instance, or take, some of the water that comes off a part of your roof, it's still going to make a difference. It's still going to help control at least that part of the water. And in some of the smaller properties that I've seen, the homeowners have done a combination of things where they have, say, a rain barrel and then and also a smaller rain garden. And then the rain barrel can collect some of the water from part of the roof, and then the rain garden can handle water from, say, another part of the roof. And then after a rain event and after the water has left the rain garden, they can release the water in the rain barrel into the rain garden so that it's empty to accept water for the next rain event. And so you can kind of create your own treatment train, so to speak, in your yard.
Thank you. Yeah, and what my biggest takeaway from this was that it can be tiny. It can be a small rain garden, and that does make a difference, especially if your whole neighborhood does it. So
right.
Even if you only have a small space, just do it. It will make a difference. This is the first presentation that I've been on where you didn't make it seem like you have to do a big grand project to make a difference. You can do just a rain barrel, even though that's all you can do.
Right.
So great question, Greta. And the last question I have here is from Andrew. He says, can you install a rain garden between the Wissahickon Creek and your home? So I imagine he lives along the creek.
Okay. So yes, you can. And actually, I think the folks that are looking, Wissahickon trails in particular, would probably be really excited if you did that, because what that could do, kind of two things, right? So one would be, it's at least going to slow the water down before it reaches the creek as it's running off your property. The other thing is that if you kind of get it in there and then it soaks into the ground, you probably have a fairly shallow water table. My guess is if you're right next to the creek, but still it's going to feed the base flow. The base flow is going to be cooler, right? And the water that then enters the Wissahickon Creek as a result of your rain garden is going to be cooler because it's had a chance to travel through soil and get cooled down before it deposits directly into the stream.
Thank you. Yeah, people that live along the creek can make a huge impact just by doing a couple things. And Greta has a follow-up question to her, the minimum size in her small yard. She says, what do you mean by tiny? How about 2 feet by 2 feet?
2 feet by 2 feet is pretty tiny. Another thing that you might want to consider if you really only have, say, 2 feet by 2 feet is a flow through planter. So that actually isn't going to take water and really soak it into the ground, but what it's really going to help with is cooling down the water as it moves through the vegetation and through the soil. So a flow through planter might be good for you. The other thing that you might want to think about is maybe something that's a little bit more along the lines of like an infiltration trench. So if you can go and dig deeper and maybe put in some sand underneath of your rain garden, you might be able to get a little more storage that way. But honestly, if you only have 2 feet by 2 feet, that's what you got. And I'd still try to make a little depression and put something in, and it's just that every little bit's going to make a difference.
Thank you. One last question here. If you do have any final questions, please get them in the chat, but I think this will be our last one for now. This comes from Kaylee. She says, my property becomes inundated with runoff from 2 streets worth of suburban houses. How big of a rain garden would you recommend? Or how small a rain garden can I get away with? And how close by could I build a structure like a shed to this area?
So listen, a shed, right? Your shed's not going to have a basement, so you can go really close to the shed. That's not going to be a big issue as far as water goes. It sounds like you've got a lot of water coming into your property. You know, it sounds, I mean, 2 whole streets worth of suburban houses, that's a significant amount of water to try to control with a residential rain garden. So you might want to kind of, I don't know, recalibrate how much water you're trying to control, and maybe not try to control all of that, and just control what it is that you can actually get into your rain garden and take a, you know, and have in that area. Otherwise, like, I'm afraid if you start trying, like, I don't know whether you're diverting all of that into your property, or well, it sounds like your property becomes inundated with this. I think you kind of got some issues here. One is that I would also talk to your township, right? Because like, you really shouldn't be getting that much runoff coming into your property and trying to manage all that on your own. But how big of a rain garden? Probably as big as you can make it. Sounds like it, based on how much water you say that you're getting. But if it's really this drastic of a flood, then I would recommend thinking about talking to your township as well.
Awesome. Looks like you answered everyone's questions.
Right.
They're not all cut and dry yes or no questions. Each yard is different, each neighborhood is different, and each watershed is different. So it's not always easy, but just following these steps can really help you get on your way. So thank you for this presentation. That was super informative and accessible. It's not as scary as some of the other presentations. You can do this, and whatever you can do will make that difference. So thank you very much for doing this presentation, and just thank you to all our partners, Villanova, William Penn Foundation, Wissahickon Trails, Pennypack Trust, and Tacony Frankfurt Watershed. If you have any questions or follow-ups to all of this, you can reach out to any of our organizations. We'd be happy to help you. Hit up those native plant nurseries. The Pennypack Trust has a plant sale in September with staff that can help you with your rain gardens and things like that. So this is a great community with lots of resources. Don't be afraid to reach out. The recording will be available. I'm not sure exactly when, but if you're interested in the recording, I'm putting my email in the chat as we speak. I'll finish that. And you can reach out to me and I can get you a recording of that, of this presentation. So I think that's all. I don't see any more questions. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you at the next event.
All right, thanks for having me.